Good evening, everybody. Geography lives, amen? Oh, come on, we could do better than that. Geography lives, amen? All right. How we doing, folks? Good, good. Tonight, we have our visiting geographical scientist, Rebecca Sheehan, speaking tonight. Dr. Sheehan is currently an associate professor of geography at Oklahoma State University. And if you don't know me, I'm Mike DeVivo, and I'm a professor of geography here at Grand Rapids Community College, home of the Raiders. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Sheehan. She was selected because of her area of interest, not necessarily so much because it is devoted to New Orleans in this particular subject, but because she is one of the few very capable and highly qualified geographers that devote themselves to field work. Field work in many ways is the essence of geography, going out and exploring part of the world or much of the world, whatever the case might be. And that field work is of dire importance so that we can gain a more thorough understanding of part of our planet. Rebecca went to Purdue University and was awarded a bachelor's in landscape architecture. She subsequently pursued a master's degree at Texas State University in San Marcos after working for a short while in planning in Austin, Texas. Later, she went to Louisiana State University and worked on her doctorate. She worked with Craig Colton and Didier DeLezer, Miles Richardson, and had really a superstar committee of stellar scholars to work with in terms of developing some geographical expertise in the field, and I'm sure in terms of scholarship in reference to historical and cultural geography. Rebecca, would you come up here for a moment, please? And,
sure.
You know, this is Rebecca Sheehan, and she's going to make this presentation for you tonight as part of the Race, Ethnicity, and Identity lecture series. And because she essentially is a good field geographer, we have a GRCC geography field cap for her to symbolize this.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah.
Turn that down.
The show is yours.
All right, great. Thank you, Mike. Well, thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation and the hospitality shown by certainly by Mike and by people here at the college and Grand Rapids. I've never been to Grand Rapids before, but growing up in the Midwest, I feel like I'm almost home, particularly with the weather. So thank you very much. Today, I'm going to be speaking, obviously you can see this here, Identity, Tourism, and Racialization in New Orleans, Jackson Square. I'm going to be speaking specifically from fieldwork, ethnographic fieldwork that I did for over a year. I also did over a year's worth of archival work. I won't be speaking about that today, but my interest in doing archival and ethnographic fieldwork was to not present or not come to conclusions of a then and now geography of Jackson Square, but a more continuous account of the ongoing geographies of Jackson Square. So what I'll do, I'll be using my notes quite a bit, but I will also be pointing out some things in some subsequent slides. There are more slides at the beginning of this talk because I want you to have an image of in your mind of what's going on in Jackson Square. Probably some of you have been to Jackson Square. How many people have been to Jackson Square? A few? Well, the rest of you need to get there soon. Just kidding. It's a wonderful place, and it's a place of contrasts in a variety of ways, but I'll get to it now. Today, New Orleans Jackson Square is a tourist attraction, a must-see in New Orleans French Quarter. The square and its surrounding structures look much as they did in 1852 when the debonair designs of Baroness Pontalba, a daughter of an influential New Orleanian, came to fruition. So since 1852, it's looked just about like this. As New Orleans developed into a commercial hub, and by the way, New Orleans was founded in 1718, so too did the status of the square. By 1734, the Catholic Church, police, governor, court, and military established buildings along the square. So this certainly was the center of the colony. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as administrative powers and ownership changed between nations, France, Spain, and the US, Place des Armes, which is what it was known then, today it's Jackson Square, continued to serve as the functional and symbolic center of New Orleans. Even when, after the Louisiana Purchase, the economic core began shifting from the French Quarter to the uptown area, the square still remained the symbolic center of the city. Over the years, the special status of the square generally compelled those who had more political and social power, usually government officials and elites, to refine the square's physical landscape and pursue restrictive measures for its social form, presenting New Orleans front and therefore its identity as ordered. In fact, the area of Place des Armes, or Jackson Square, including the church and river, became sacred ground in the minds of those with more political and social influence, usually those of European and Anglo descent who were white. Now we're talking current popular representations of Jackson Square as a monument to the nation's and New Orleans' colonial and bourgeois history, as well as a contemporary, quaint, and elegant public space for artists, specialty shops, and tourists dominate official discourse. So here we see the Pontalba Buildings, that's the name of the last name of the Baroness, the Pontalba Buildings that she created that are flanking the square. We also see, I guess I could use the pointer, here is the square, kind of an aerial or bird's eye view of it, and here is an artist. Now this is the dominant representation that the city and those in power are putting forth, that it's an area of historical significance and that there are sidewalk artists all around the square, not in the square, but outside on the edge of the square. So that's what the official discourse, the dominant official discourse is. This discourse, excuse me just a second, and when we talk about discourse, what we really are talking about is the conversation that's going on, the information that is being put forth in the world through the media, through websites, through any kind of promotion of tourism. It's that conversation that I refer to in terms of discourse. Some more photos. Okay, this discourse put forth by the city and by the city of New Orleans and those organizations with more political and economic power convey little of its dynamic qualities. With tourism as the primary economy in the French Quarter, everyday life in the square and its pedestrian mall that borders it includes artists, musicians, entertainers, homeless folks, and transient persons, local residents, tarot card and palm readers, and tourists intermingling and interacting. So I want to show you a series of slides that this includes. And so here we have more artists. We have musicians, street musicians that play in Jackson Square. More musicians playing for tips. They're not paid by anyone, and it's a public space, so they can be there in some capacity, which we'll get to in a little bit. A magician here with a crowd of tourists. They call these mimes, even though they're not the traditional mime with the white face and doing that sort of thing. And these folks stand quite still like statues, and if you take a picture, then you're supposed to tip. So remember that if you go there. And so these folks are there to be earning tourist dollars. And so more mimes, one that looks like Michael Jackson. And this is just across from Jackson Square in the amphitheater area. And we see some acrobatics going on across tourists. He made it, by the way, so it looks like he's going to fall right on them, doesn't it? Lucky dogs, of course. Got to have your lucky dog. Of course, it's a $5 dog, so I'm not exactly sure if you want to pay that much. And then we have clowns and even shoe shiners. This shoe shiner can be there because he was grandfathered in, because there are lots of ordinances in terms of restricting space, who can use the space and where, how. Homeless folks taking a nap. And I should also note that there are lots of folks who nap in Jackson Square, and it's not just homeless folks. It's not just the people who are working there, it's also tourists. And I can talk more about this later if you have questions about some of these other groups. More tarot card readers. Let's see, where am I on the? I think I have even more to go here. And so what is important to see here is that you see the psychic reading here, but you see the artist in the back, right? So a lot of different people here, more art in the back, and readers here in the front. And these are the two ladies in the back, more in the back, are the readers reading the cards or the palm of a tourist. Okay, so all of these activities are taking place on Jackson Square's Pedestrian Mall. These activities are not taking place inside the mall. People can go there and hang out, but they can't perform music, they can't read tarot cards, they can't sell art. You could be in there and paint, but you can't sell your art there. Sometimes this area is reserved for special occasions. If you pay a particular fee, then you could have a reception here, for example. But this pedestrian mall, which in this picture, in this photograph, it's still a road, but this is all a pedestrian area here. So keep that in mind. When I'm talking about Jackson Square and these activities, I'm generally talking about this pedestrian mall area. So these activities in Jackson Square have been highly contested for decades and seemingly undermine to some the true historical, renowned, and genteel status and image of New Orleans. The disjuncture between official discourse and the square's actual workings is particularly evident in its day-to-day significance, as for centuries it has bustled with a variety of activities and people. This tension, however, has been fodder for the racialization of some groups that dwell in Jackson Square, that are in Jackson Square. And so what do I mean by racialization? Racialization may be defined as the processes by which one group asserts that another group is inferior biologically and socially, intertwining physical traits and cultural activities. Moreover, practices of racialization may rely on a variety of physical and cultural facets, which may or may not include skin color. Through racialization, the exclusion of some groups from certain realms and places may occur, or at least be attempted. So when we talk about racialization here, often when we think of racism, we think about ethnicity and race as a social construction of race. But in this idea of racialization, certain cultural groups that may be of the same ethnicity as me might become racialized from their cultural characteristics, activities, and how they look, as in if they're unkempt or if they look too different from you and me. So that's an important part of this in terms of racialization, that it's not just about ethnicity and race as we generally think about it, but it's about racializing particular cultural groups. Significantly, such public landscapes like Jackson Square, those vested with iconic historical and/or tourist status, can be read as exclusive, where dominant sensibilities pervade how they are understood, who is allowed to use them, and how they are used. Accordingly, the U.S. public then becomes understood as a particular homogenized white middle class. Geographers and other social scientists, however, have also argued that such prevailing representations do not tell the entire story and explore the dynamism of such exclusive landscapes, and that's what I would like to do today. Due to time limitations, however, here I examine only a few facets concerning identity and racialization that intersect in and with Jackson Square's dynamic landscape. First, I explain the development of tourism in New Orleans based on an idealized past. Then I explain how occultism merged with tourism in New Orleans, and when I talk about occultism, I mean tarot card and palm reading, and more recently, how it emerged in Jackson Square, specifically, again, tarot card and palm reading. Both historical and more contemporary interactions reveal racialized discourses and practices which contribute to deep socio-cultural divisions between groups in New Orleans and in Jackson Square. On the one hand, these divisions expose predominant ideas of a homogenized white middle class as the public. On the other hand, as I show, these divisions reveal the functioning of a multifaceted, contentious, as well as a cooperative public. So I'm here today not just to tell you the doom and gloom of what is happening in terms of racialization, but I'm also here to show you openings in terms of how this more multifaceted, more diverse public is actually practiced in Jackson Square. So this is this idea of hope of different groups coming together in practice. And that's a big point of what I want to make today. Okay. Developing tourism in New Orleans. So I now turn to the development of tourism and then how it became intertwined with occultist practices. Early tourism boosters drew inspiration from the preservation movement. The French Quarter is the oldest historic district in the country, the second oldest, just behind Charleston. And so they've long had a preservationist mindset in terms of their city. With the preservationist movement in the French Quarter codified in 1937 through the creation of the Vieux Carré Commission, and Vieux Carré is often what the French Quarter is called, and it just means old square or old town. Preservationists put forth efforts to control, during this time, to control the historic neighborhood's total character. This meant that in perpetuity, the architecture, these material qualities of the French Quarter, and activities, meaning practices, would manifest social performances or social displays situated in their ideal of the French Quarter's quaint 19th century past. So this is extremely important because the Vieux Carré Commission and this preservation movement, in terms of the total character, was aiming not just to control the way it looked, but activities that occurred there. And this continues today. Preservationists focused their efforts on Royal Street, St. Louis Cathedral, and the Jackson Square area. And if we look at, these are postcards, of course, and if we, Royal Street runs just 1 block north of Jackson Square, so just 1 block north of it. St. Louis Cathedral, as you can see from the photos that we've had before, or images, is right here, and the Jackson Square area. Now what we see here is this very genteel image of Jackson Square, and here even of the levee, right? And these are early 20th century postcards. This is more mid-century postcard. But this is a particular idea, a particular image that's being put forth. So preservationists focus their efforts on the Royal Street area, St. Louis Cathedral, and Jackson Square to champion a refined white image of the city, ensuring Jackson Square's iconic status. Tourism boosters, in part, relied on this image to promote tourism. In the early 20th century, as the preservation movement in the city gained momentum and white middle-class urban mass tourism grew in the U.S., so mass tourism was really gaining ground in the U.S. in the early 20th century, so too did tourism in New Orleans, with the French Quarter at its center. In New Orleans, preservationists composed largely of the white middle class women, and tourism boosters composed of white men aimed to create a history, a place in industry constructed by whites and for whites, even though people of color played an integral role in the city, including the French Quarter. So what's important here too is when we think about white elites, this excludes generally Creoles, and today Creoles, if you're Creole, you would be considered someone of European blood and someone of African or African American blood, of a mixing. But Creole initially was the term given to those who were of European descent but born in the French colony of New Orleans. So your parents are from Europe, from France or Spain. You're born in the colony, you're Creole. And in fact, in publications, these little condensed history of New Orleans, folks go to great effort to make sure that you know how Creole is defined. So we all know that words emerge with a particular meaning, and then those meanings change over time. But here we have Creole being really trying to be owned by a particular group of people. And this is just an example of this whitening of the French Quarter, of New Orleans, and of tourism. And there's much more. I'm just giving you a brief background on this phenomenon, and I have particular references if anyone is interested on a more detailed account. So the preservationist and tourism leaders who shaped the French Quarter and Jackson Square envisioned a white public with middle-class sensibilities. This idea of the public facilitated a successful tourist economy for the area, initially excluding New Orleans' long history of occultist practices and people of color. For most of the 20th century, this white culture, this white milieu, meant that people of color served as a spectacle for white tourists in the French Quarter, holding only servile positions in hospitality and entertainment businesses. And if we look at images of postcards then, and it's hard to see, we see this kind of caricature of people of color. In fact, this postcard that I got off of eBay, I did a lot of eBaying when I was doing this research, it says, my dear Uncle Jim, you can't help liking these little fellows, plenty of them. And so we see this is a particular time period, of course, but it is indeed this idea of a spectacle and something that is very much a caricature of those that were not white. White authorities deemed any other form of participation in French Quarter life by people of color as an undesirable element that would bring defilement to the Vieux Carré heritage. As Crusher, a geographer, carefully shows, New Orleans has a long history of some whites disassociating people of color with high culture. And as preservationists and tourism boosters, we're trying to really promote the Royal Street area, the church and the Jackson Square area as a part of high culture and high white culture. We can see why people of color might be excluded. In my research, those folks that had long been a part of New Orleans and the French Quarter, particularly those of color, said that if you were a person of color and you were in the French Quarter, you had to have a name tag on. You had to have a name tag on and usually a uniform, because that meant that you worked for a particular hotel or you worked somewhere and you were in the service industry. If you didn't have those kinds of identifying markers on you, then you would be questioned and often pushed out of the quarter. In order to further distance and justify shunning people of color from the French Quarter, whites created associations between depraved behavior and occultist practices, namely voodoo, and attributed voodoo rituals only to people of color. This practice was part of a larger project of racialization in the city. And so voodoo's home is in New Orleans, a particular form of voodoo. There's different spellings of voodoo, and there's voodoo all across the world, but the marriage of the syncretic marriage of Catholicism and voodoo, of Catholicism and African cultural belief systems, religious belief systems, really was born in New Orleans. It was born in New Orleans because unwittingly in 1717, when slave ships came to New Orleans, they brought African cultures with them, of course, right? And so on Sundays, people of color, slaves, could actually be just north of the quarter in Congo Square and practice their beliefs, right? So soon, there was a merging of Catholicism and African belief systems, creating voodoo. Marie Laveau, the first voodoo priestess, was actually a devout Catholic. So she had a deal with the priest of St. Louis Cathedral that if she made sure the parishioners were there on Sunday, that he would help with delicate matters of out-of-wedlock births and marriages across social lines, that sort of thing. And so what does this hint to? This hints to that it wasn't just people of color, and in fact, scholars such as Martha Ward have shown that not just people of color practice voodoo, but whites and even elites practice voodoo or were a part of occultist belief systems. Even the courts believed in the 1700s. They never doubted the power of potions and spells. And so all of this is documented. So we see that voodoo was not just in the world of people of color, but also in white and Creole New Orleans. So tourism and occultism in New Orleans. By the late 1920s, though at odds with preservationists and tourism boosters, with their ideas of white purity, tourist occultist practices made their way into the French Quarter, but not into the Jackson Square area, at least not in the 1920s. Shops and museums offered, for example, charms, potions, herbal medicines, candles, voodoo dolls, and oils, as well as on-staff psychics, spiritualists, fortune tellers, or card readers, reminiscent of past conjurers, and those are people that have magical means of transforming reality. Eventually, some shops and advisors were not entirely connected to voodoo. Rather, other occultist traditions such as Wicca, spiritualism, animism of particular flavors, including those traditions from the West, the White West, such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and New Age movements, came to have homes in the French Quarter. In the West, occultism emerged as conflicting with traditional Christian doctrine, as well as incompatible with that which was rational and scientific. Western occultist practices have their origins in the late 19th century European Golden Dawn factions. These were underground societies made up of intellectuals, eccentrics, and alchemists. These societies' ceremonies took place underground, and only the initiated could perform rituals such as tarot card reading and palm reading, adding to their perceived impenetrability. Also in Europe, folk Christianity, often coupled with popular magic, was compatible with many traditional religions in Africa, but outwardly not accepted nor seen by the middle class. Within these views, only those primitive, less evolved people, both spiritually and intellectually, believed in occultist powers and practices. So here we start to see some racialization forming. It follows, as Pyle explains, Steve Pyle, geographer, explains that all occultist practices, such as magic, became disassociated with the character of modern civilization and of the modern city. These expectations and actual practices of occultism in the West have placed occultism in subaltern locations, private spaces, or outside the city. So we're going to get to how it made it into Jackson Square in just a bit. Typically, occultist practices have certainly not located in a city's prized public space, such as the Jackson Square area, nor have practitioners been viewed as part of the normative public. Over time, individualized and hodgepodge occultist practices, drawing from a variety of occultist traditions and a greater variety of people, including those from an array of races, used paranormal beliefs outside of traditional religious beliefs to earn tourist dollars in New Orleans. And so this is what we see about tourism and capitalism, is that they find their markets, right? Capitalism, tourism, creates markets, finds markets, seeks markets, right? And what does tourism often capitalize on? History, right? And with this voodoo past, this occultist past, it was only a matter of time before it made its way into the French Quarter and ultimately Jackson Square. Notwithstanding racial stereotypes of all occultist practices that pervaded popular accounts, the government and preservation movement in New Orleans, occultist shops continued in the French Quarter as tourism continued to grow. And here we see, or we don't, we see how occultism in the form of voodoo has emerged within tourism. And so we see voodoo on the bayou, Allsouls Feast, Saturday, October 28th, 2006. We see Marie Laveau's House of Voodoo. You can also get readings there. We see voodoo dolls, cheap voodoo dolls that you can buy anywhere in the French Quarter. We see also New Orleans Voodoo Festival, right? Fantastic. And, of course, the Voodoo Mart Liquor and Gifts. So we see how capitalism and tourism has really co-opted voodoo. Nonetheless, occultist readers of energy bones, palms, and tarot cards worked in mystical shops, remaining outside the purview of the elegant, faithful, and ordered image that the Jackson Square area, including St. Louis Cathedral, arguably the most identifiable symbol of Christianity in New Orleans, presented. St. Louis Cathedral also happens to be the oldest operating church in North America, or at least in the United States. And actually the church is, in terms of the location, it's burned down a few times, as most cities in the 17 and 1800s had a series of huge fires. So that's important. Now, rendering a contentious public, and this is getting more into the ethnographic part of my work. Let's talk about artist tourism and hippies. The Jackson Square area, however, did attract those seeking tourist dollars, which created the necessary grist for a contentious, heterogeneous public to form in the public area. In the 1950s, sidewalked artists from Pirates Alley next to St. Louis Cathedral spilled over into the square's pavements to paint and sell their work to tourists. Newspapers began referring to these artists as the art colony. Moreover, the art colony became erroneously associated with the French Quarter in Jackson Square's 19th century white middle-class past. So the art colony on Jackson Square became associated with a 19th century past, conflated that time. And by doing that, they were able and have been able to successfully argue for their dominance in the square. When in fact, the art colony or the art movement in New Orleans actually started in the American sector and eventually made its way to the French Quarter. And this was in terms of artists painting and selling their work. It first happened in that Pirates Alley, and the earliest that I could locate a time for that was 1948. When in the late 1960s, so this is a bit of a shift, transients and hippies began appearing in Jackson Square, and that was a quote from someone. Some thought of their presence as an invasion that threatened the total character of the square in the French Quarter. In 1967, Jackson Square artists responded by petitioning the city council to devote more police protection to the area. Despite the American Civil Liberties Union's supposed constraint on the city and police actions, officers began arresting people, often those homeless, for begging, sleeping, eating, and other acts under various vagrancy laws. Those targeted were called furry people, who were also uncouth and foul. Thus, those interests which were part of the normative public had again turned to racialization to exclude those people not part of the area's imagined white past. So such practices and a language of distancing are often utilized to construct social groups as alien, foreign, and other. In other words, these groups and the worlds which they inhabit are actively disconnected through processes of constructing them as disorderly, even though most hippies and near hippies, as some would say, were white. The city and elite's reactions to their invasion were acts of racialization, intertwining physical characteristics and cultural activities that position them out of place in public spaces such as Jackson Square. So other tourism opportunities. In 1970, the creation of the less restrictive Pedestrian Mall adjacent to the square increased the amount of public space for pedestrians, with more space and tourism numbers significantly increasing each year in the French Quarter. Economic opportunities inadvertently increased for those who sought tourist dollars, such as all those folks that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, right, of the entertainers, the mimes, the musicians, the magicians, and so on. Additionally, a black exodus occurred, which black French Quarter residents blamed on white gentrification, which they associated with an implicit racism. Tension over Jackson Square's Pedestrian Mall intensified as increasing numbers of people and activities, including at least one tarot card reader at this time, competed for space. Years of struggle ensued and are ensuing, with various street entertainers fighting for their right to carry out their talents in the square area. This resulted in the city increasing limitations, such as restricting locations in the Pedestrian Mall for all those seeking tourist dollars, except street artists, with over 200 artists annually paying a permit fee to locate on the square's Pedestrian Mall. From the 1990s, the number of tarot card and palm readers on Jackson Square's Pedestrian Mall increased at a greater rate, and this could be gleaned from archival work of petitions and arguments in the newspaper that that I uncovered. So, perhaps in part this increase was due to the majority of people, however, in the U.S. believing in paranormal beliefs outside of Christianity. And I do have reference for this. This isn't just my opinion. Though the West ostensibly still dismisses occultism, paranormal beliefs outside of traditional religious beliefs, such as Christianity, even paranormal beliefs outside of these still continue in the U.S. as more people than not attest to believing in classic paranormal phenomena such as astrology, ghosts, psychic healing, and deja vu. It's less surprising then that by the early 2000s, on any given day, roughly up to 40 readers positioned their setups in the Pedestrian Mall, reigniting disputes over space with artists as well as racialized arguments. Readers. Though the majority of readers were white, they included a vast array of, during my research, a vast array of female and male individuals. For example, readers demonstrated a variety of educational levels, from high school dropouts to PhDs. Yes, there are people with doctorate degrees out there reading palms and tarot cards. And actually, one of them was a political scientist who graduated with top honors from the University of New Orleans. So a variety of ages, young adults to elderly persons, housing situations, sometimes homeless to home-owning individuals, sexual orientations, and the amount of time they were in New Orleans, new arrivals to long-term or native residents. They explained to me that their training and how long they had read cards and or palms, which varied immensely. Some readers had taught the craft to themselves in as little as an afternoon, while other readers had trained over several years in classes or with a mentor. Certainly a range of readers, from those who considered their practices a part of their religion or spirituality, to those who considered their abilities secular or supernatural, to some who felt they were street entertainers, worked in the Jackson Square area. First and foremost, readers were in Jackson Square for tourist dollars. If readers did not regularly earn money from tourists, many doing so as their full-time means of making a living, readers would not have continued to set up in the square to ply their craft. In my field work, though readers in the Pedestrian Mall had continued to be mostly white, those against readers put forth loosely concealed racialized arguments that characterized them as inferior and even filthy and dirty. These disputes largely played out in the media, city council meetings, and courts, and through municipal legislation. During this time, a consensus formed among those with more political power. Elite preservationist shop owners in the Pontalba Buildings on Jackson Square, certain homeowner associations, artists, and the Monsignor of St. Louis Cathedral aimed to exclude occultist practices in the Jackson Square area because they viewed such practices as inconsistent with the square's total character. Shop owners and artists insisted, perhaps ironically, that largely due to the readers, Jackson Square had lost its spiritual and mystical qualities and that the area was deteriorating and scary. Even though readers legally could set up in front of St. Louis Cathedral, the Monsignor regularly persuaded police officers to direct readers to other locations on the Pedestrian Mall. One artist claimed that the readers were fakes and barely one step above the homeless. So they had a 2-for-1 there in terms of racialization, right? Moreover, likening readers to the beastliness of livestock, a shop owner explained that in the square, livestock once grazed, and now tarot card readers. They need to go. These examples show the persistent racialization against occultist cultures and others, revealing that they excluded those persons near the margins of society from membership in the public. The same artist who called readers fakes also declared that the Vieux Carré Commission had the power from the state to have the readers removed because, according to him, they were not a part of the French Quarter's total character as the artists were. In addition, this artist and others argued that the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that special care and rules could be taken to preserve national historic places such as the French Quarter, which includes the Jackson Square area, which includes the Jackson Square area, even though artists were not actually part of Jackson Square's 19th century total character. A prominent reader in the square explained, however, that for over 25 years, readers had been a part of the square area, and collectively, readers called themselves square readers. So some ownership that they are having with the square, or at least association, attachment. Readers regularly asserted that their occult practices had long been part of the French Quarter, some explaining that they were connected to traditions of the voodoo priestess Marie Laveau. But no government official or entity formally or informally recognized readers in any of these capacities in terms of the occultist past and present of the French Quarter in New Orleans. This allowed those with more power to frame their arguments against readers as natural, echoing the racist sentiments of past preservationists and tourism boosters. Thinly veiling these sentiments, white council member Jackie Clarkson pleaded that she wanted the Jackson Square area and the French Quarter to be the way they were in the 1940s, when, quote, people were bohemian, but they did not smell bad, and they were not filthy and dirty, end quote, in order to gain support for her proposed cleanup ordinances. Her ordinances focused on the elimination of readers on the square area, going so far as to display in her office the sign, "Read my mind, no more Thoreau." The opposition towards readers impelled them to organize, creating the General Assembly of Psychics of Jackson Square. Several members collectively filed lawsuits, winning back at least some rights from each of Clarkson's successive ordinances that limited or eliminated their use of Jackson Square's Pedestrian Mall. And the readers' victories, they were restricted to work on a donation basis and relegated to certain spaces, severely limiting their numbers. Readers relied on normalized notions of freedom of speech and religious rights in public spaces and for equal treatment under those guises. No other legal avenues supported their place in the square because the political and legal milieu prevented readers from successfully arguing for any alternative historical, religious, or economic incarnation for what they did. Mitchell explains that no legal means exist to fight for basic necessary uses of public spaces, of course, particularly for homeless persons, to example, sleep or take shelter. Instead, homeless persons' struggles must have their legal rights to public spaces presented in ways that conform to how the majority envisages proprieties of public spaces. Similarly, in the Jackson Square area, reader struggles reveal how limited and normative legal understandings did not support their use of public space, and where racialization, shrouded by the pretext of historic preservation, excluded their place in public space and, importantly, as part of the public. Those with more power framed and continue to frame readers to be in opposition to the public, New Orleans and the Jackson Square area, as well as to be without a place in their history and present day. Nevertheless, processes in this section reveal a contentious public, a heterogeneous public at work in the public sphere. Now, that was the bad side. And here we see, I wanted to point out the area where the readers and the artists can set up. We're about ready to go into the cooperative publics, which is, I think, a much more refreshing look at this ethnographic data. So here we have the Jackson Square. Here's the General Andrew Jackson, a statue of him, savior of New Orleans in the Battle of New Orleans. So he's New Orleans' savior, but I also have to say, now that I live in Oklahoma, that he was also the architect for the Trail of Tears. So one person's hero is another person's villain. Here is the amphitheater. This is where those folks were doing the acrobatics, and this is Decatur Street. This is a street that has traffic on it now. This St. Peter Street, St. Anne Street, and Charter Street here are all part of the Pedestrian Mall, so you can walk around here. There are benches, and all of this is grass area and trees and ornamental shrubs. Now, in terms of, wait a minute, artists, they can set up anywhere around the square area. Even this area here, which is this area here, that's a very narrow area, and you can also get a carriage ride here. Artists can still set up here, and they can put all of their work on the fence. So they hang their work, and they can paint there, and they can talk to tourists. However, this is where readers can set up. And in part, it's because they have to set up at least 20 feet from the fence because artists are there. But then there's also difficulty with pedestrian walkways, so they have to have an ample amount of space. So in reality, this is what they're left with, is this area here. Interestingly enough, because they have this limited area, they often set up right next to each other, so they kind of form this line. So it's not even broken up, and it's interesting too because it's we have tarot card and palm readers right next to St. Louis Cathedral, which is an interesting juxtaposition. Now, when it comes to other performers, other entertainers, oftentimes there are musicians here and here. Sometimes you have magicians around here, sometimes on the corner. You also see mimes here on the corner, mimes here, mimes here, mimes here. And there's always kind of the push and pull. But certainly the big battle in probably the last 10 years, 15 years for that matter, have been with the artists and the readers. And so they are very much, the readers are very much relegated to that area. Okay. Rendering a cooperative public. Indeed, both readers and tourists facilitated the perpetuation of reader and tourist sessions, right? So they're there for tourist dollars. They're not going to be there if they do not earn tourist dollars. In my field work, when policing and legality concerned readers, they rarely turned on each other, and even occasional irritated tourists still usually donated at least some money for their session. So if they sat down with someone and they didn't like what they heard, or they were upset, they still gave them some money. And so that shows this continuation, right, of people, of readers being there in the square. So in my research, tourists, usually white and middle class, and thus members of this normative public, regularly sat down with readers for between 15 and 45 minutes, and occasionally for hours at a time. Readers and tourists created compatible and reciprocal relations, creating a cooperative public of sociability. I aim to show that readers, targets of contemporary racialization, and tourists, mostly members of the normative public, not only reside next to each other, but intimately interact emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, and economically, creating a cooperative, embodied, heterogeneous public in place. That's a mouthful and a mindful. So let's take a look at readers' setups and their guises. To attract tourists to have their cards or palms read, each Jackson Square reader portrayed a distinctive theme, creating a mosaic of identities. Reader setups included 2 or 3 chairs, cards, a sign, and trinkets that complemented unique fashion, personal appearances, often linked to ideas of New Orleans' occultist past. For example, Velvet, her setup imparted a Victorian feel with lush reds and purples intricately designed on clothes that covered her table and chairs. On her table, small iridescent pebbles resided next to a ruby red colored velour pouch that contained her tarot cards. Additionally, 2 brass ornate candlesticks held slender cranberry tinted candles that glowed while sage burned from a small wooden tray. Positioned on the Pedestrian Mall, a sinuous haze often surrounded Velvet, in stark contrast to the prominent and exclusive landscape of Jackson Square and its surrounding buildings, especially St. Louis Cathedral. Velvet dressed in dark indigo, scarlet, pink, or turquoise blouses, skirts and shawls fashioning more mystique. Crimped hair draped over her shoulders and necklaces, rings, and bracelets adorned her skin. Velvet and her setup invoked a New Orleans conjurer of the past, as did those who invoked images of voodoo priests and priestesses, harlots, witches, warlocks, and sorcerers. Some readers took on particular names to promote their image further. I think this calls for a drink of water. Velvet certainly did, as did Feather, Swamp Witch, and Crow. Other readers promoted their qualifications or specialties, such as pro-psychic, empathetic, tarot, or shaman. These names were usually displayed on stylized signs at each reader's setup and were meant to make one stop, think, and imagine. As in the case of Miss Lena's sign, which stated, if you are not happy with your life, sit down with Miss Lena. I can feel the energy on your palm. The vibrations speak to me. George's sign explained the benefit of tarot and palm reading and displayed a picture of the Dixie Chicks with the caption, as seen on the Dixie Chicks CD cover. Thus, names suggesting unconventional abilities and naming associations situated in mainstream culture were meant to draw in tourists. Readers' greetings. As tourists walked by, many readers offered good evening or hello, if you have any questions, I am here. When a reader sensed interest, he or she offered a more personal invitation, such as, come on, honey, you need a reading. While others made only a simple invitation with their hand for tourists to sit with them. Kind of like that. I always loved when they did that. Some readers, however, provided more mysterious enticements. For example, on occasion, Clark used a method called rolling. First, he made eye contact with a tourist walking by. Next, in a skillful rhythmic motion, he snapped a card, showing it to the tourist. Finally, taking his sight off the tourist, he fixed his eyes on the card, contemplating its significance. In doing so, Clark could pique a tourist's interest, drawing the person in to sit for a reading. Through multiple facets of display, sociability, and position, which were linked to an imagined past and present, as well as current economic milieu, readers initiated curiosity, contact, and interaction with tourists. Readers also repeatedly inscribed difference onto Jackson Square, contrasting to its dominant representations that exclude heterogeneity. The intimate interactions between readers and tourists, also known as clients, during a session revealed temporary but importantly repeated expressions of a cooperative, heterogeneous public in practice. Once a tourist, now a client, sat with a reader, he or she explained more about the reader's qualifications and how the session would unfold. For example, Lena elaborated with each client that she had 200 years of psychic abilities in her family, and that practicing the tarot and palm were part of her family's religious system. Clark always commenced a reading by saying he used the Mahovan method, the oldest method of reading the tarot, according to Clark. Then he told his client the significance of each position in the Mahovan layout. During the reading, Clark would explain each drawn card and then ask if the person understood what he had just illuminated. If not, together, and this is so important, together they would discuss further the meaning of the card and its position as it related to the client. In addition, Clark had developed a methodical and elaborate shuffling system for each reading, asking his client to look directly into his eyes before each shuffle. Though Clark's technique was probably the most involved, all readers confidently guided sessions with their clients. Sessions with readers covered past, present, and future matters such as character traits, health, love, family, finances, education, and employment of the client. These are big topics. These are big issues. Readers employed both nonverbal and verbal techniques, frequently holding a client's hand, leaning in toward the client, or whispering in a client's ear when revealing more personally sensitive information about their client. As, again, together, reader and client explored topics and issues emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. These sessions produced nervous laughter, silence, frustration, joy, shock, surprise, and occasionally even tears in clients. Experiencing a different place, a different world, tourists desired to acquire knowledge from different people in that world. Even those persons getting a reading for fun and who stated that they did not believe in the tarot and palm or were not sure still showed a glimmer of maybe in their eyes. Maybe this person has the ability to see or to understand something that I cannot. As readers displayed confidence in how they conducted readings, they also directly asserted power and knowledge. For example, near the end of a session, Godwin, a self-proclaimed pagan warlock, leaned in toward his client and declared that he had already known everything about her. Continuing, he stated that he was a reader and a psychic. Before the reading, Godwin said that he had looked into her eyes and into her soul. Uneasy silence followed, marking both the lack of physical and social personal space between them. And Godwin's assertion, conventional ideas were transgressed concerning how knowledge is gained, held, and given, and by whom. Thus, as these readings, usually with mainstream tourists, weave with the traditional representations of the Jackson Square area, the social field between margin and center leveled a bit. One person near the margins of society may have a greater presence or even legitimacy, at least for a few moments, than a person situated in the normative public. Though occultist practices are marginalized in Western society, in the square's Pedestrian Mall, they were and are displayed, engaged, and validated via tourism in an iconic public space. Moreover, some readers explained that they had an enduring effect on clients, especially those annual tourist clients who returned to the Jackson Square Pedestrian Mall, seeking the same reader from a previous year's reading. As Lena proudly stated, people come back to me. People come back to me. I don't remember them. No, I don't. I see so many people, but they always remember me. In these ways, more marginalized members of society, readers, could exhibit, if only temporarily, but repeatedly, a more integrated social position with those members of society included in the normative public, those tourists. Along the mall, a pattern of whispering exchanges between readers and clients developed, creating purposely private, at times secretive spaces, transgressing the proprieties of public space, yet simultaneously openly demonstrated unconventional cultural and economic practices between two very different groups. So, whereas literature exposing revanchist practices might suggest that an aesthetics of place agenda by those with more power cleanses these public places from undesirables, the negotiation of such sites, both historically and more recently, as I have shown, are more complicated. These practices of tourist readers may render a more cooperative public than one that can be interpreted from prevailing representations of the Jackson Square area and its long history of contestation. Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you so much for an excellent rendition of your work devoted to Jackson Square, especially with this concentration on tarot readers. It brings about more questions in a lot of different ways. One thing that I'm thinking about right now is what ploys did individual readers have that you found especially striking? What was especially effective? And two, did you find tourists going from one reader to the next?
Well, I think what I found what was most provocative for readers in terms of drawing in tourists, that's what your question is, part of it, is for them to do much like what Clark did, is to hold a card up or to say something about what they could see about that person individually. So making a personal connection and directly looking into their eyes, as opposed to, hey, do you want a reading? So it was that they could see something in you. And so they would say, oh, I see something in your future tomorrow. Or you've had a hard time, let me talk to you about that. So they tried to make that personal connection right away, and that was very effective. And what was the second part? Oh, did they go from reader to reader? Well, what would often happen is that if someone was interested in getting a reading, you would see them look around, right? And they would, and this is, so when I was there, when I was doing my research, at one time, readers could set up on all sides. So oftentimes, they would walk around the square, they would take a loop, right? And they would talk to individuals, and then they would usually, with a friend or something, discuss which one they thought, right? And then they would go back to, then they would find that person and go sit with them. And oftentimes they would sit down without saying a word. And so often the people, the tourists, the reader that they picked was usually extremely different from them. Now you might say, well, all the readers were different from them if they were part of this normative public, but usually in terms of ethnicity, in terms of gender, race, age, so people were really seeking out difference. And I don't want to create this kind of Pollyanna view of Jackson Square and readers. There's certainly a lot of contention there, as I pointed out early in my talk and throughout my talk. But really, they continue to be there because tourists want them.
It's fascinating. I'd like to open the floor for questions. Does anybody have a question that's especially striking? Go ahead.
How large is the square in acres or feet or whatever?
It's about 300 by 300. It's very small. And so it's a super short city block, probably like about a half city block, 300 by 300. And many people there who work there a lot and who are there a lot call it a microcosm of the world.
It's fascinating. Other questions?
There's one back there.
Oh.
Would you say there was a lot of emotion, like people really into it, or is it just like a feel-good kind of thing, like they just like to hear it for fun?
Well, I think there was a mixture. There was a huge mixture of it. I mean, I knew tarot card readers who would have someone sit down with them for hours at a time and really be into it and completely buy into it. And there were others who would only spend about 15 minutes. It also depended on the tarot card reader. I had one, I didn't go into this, but one of the readers, actually Clark, he would tell me that you have to fall in love with the person. So he was very serious about what he did. And he would say when he would get into a groove, that people would throw money at him because he was so good at what he did. And so this is a kind of a marriage of the economic, right, and the caring, which we don't necessarily think go together. But for him, it worked. And so there were certainly people who, I mean, crying wasn't a rare occurrence, but laughter wasn't rare either. So there was a full spectrum.
Very interesting. Other questions? Go ahead.
How did you first get interested in like this specific area? Because the idea of kind of whitewashing history is probably not specific to this area, but how did you find this specific area to be one that you really wanted to concentrate on?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a long answer, but I'll try to short up. I was interested, when I went, I knew I was interested in cultural landscapes, okay? I knew I was interested in identity. I went to Louisiana State, and I was doing my coursework, and I was thinking about all these different topics that I could study, right? And so I was thinking about this and thinking about that, and then I actually had a professor say, you know, Jackson Square in New Orleans, no one has done really any scholarly work on it. It needs to be done. And at first, I was hesitant for a variety. I mentioned earlier today that, you know, the place smelled, right? I was there in August. He took me down there, and it smelled like urine, throw up. It was hot, it was sticky, it was gross, and there was just this cacophony of activity, and I thought, how am I going to make any sense out of this place? And of course, as a graduate student, as a researcher, that's what we're called to do, but I think I was just really intimidated by it. But what I realized is that work had not been done on this particular public space, and that was important to do. And plus, I had initially really wanted to do foreign field work, but Craig Colton told me, he's like, New Orleans is the closest to foreign field work you'll get in this country. So that was pretty funny. So that's how I came to choose Jackson Square.
One more question here.
What role, if any, did the square play in like the healing process following Hurricane Katrina?
Well, great question. It was a staging area in some ways. More like a parking lot for very large equipment, because you can think about that Pedestrian Mall being able to hold a lot of different kind of equipment and vehicles. The inside of Jackson Square often held a lot of supplies right after Hurricane Katrina. But you know, Jackson Square in the French Quarter, that's the bread and butter of tourism in New Orleans. And so they wanted to get that place up and running as quickly as possible in terms of being a tourist attraction again. And so that was only there for a limited amount of time. And when I say limited, I mean many months, right? I mean, the New Orleans, as we all know, it's still in recovery. Not so much the French Quarter and the areas that are part of a tourist economy and those areas that have more money. But other areas are still suffering. Now, interestingly, many of the people that I associated with during my field work in Jackson Square, the only way I could ever get a hold of them was by going to the square. And so I went back to Jackson Square a couple months after Katrina, and you know, I saw a lot of people that I knew that had returned. And interestingly, a lot of those people that were on a precarious living conditions that were in New Orleans and in the Jackson Square area that often called Jackson Square home, you know, had survival capabilities in many ways. And so I was happy to see them. But I think that after the initial push to clean up parts of the French Quarter, they were, you know, back, you know, trying to quaff the vegetation and pull out trees and get that square back and running, right? Because this is it's still the image of, well, one of the big images of New Orleans for its identity. So, and if you remember, where did President Bush give his address after Hurricane Katrina? It was in Jackson Square. So he purposely chose that square because of what it symbolized for the residents there and for the country. So,
We have any other questions? Yes.
What role does Jackson Square play in the larger economy of New Orleans?
Well, it plays in terms of actual dollars and cents. It's hard to put a number on that, but because it is an image that is used in tourism literature, it plays a very big role. In terms of the informal economy, regarding musicians, tarot card readers, magicians, mimes, it plays a big role. But you know, and with Jackson statue at the middle, I mean, everyone comes to Jackson Square. If you're in the French Quarter, you have to go get your picture taken in front of the statue, because that's what we do, right? We take our pictures in front of statues when we go tour, and so it is part of the flow of New Orleans. And you know, New Orleans also, you know, if I want to get a beer at a store, I just go get a beer, and if I want to drink it outside, as long as it's not in a bottle, I can just carry it outside. So a lot of times tourists will take their hurricanes or their drinks or whatever, and you know, they need a break from Bourbon Street, or they need a break from the shops, and they'll go in Jackson Square and sit down. So it's kind of a node in the French Quarter, and it's certainly at the center. Even though it's on the river, it's not right at the center. It's still central in the French Quarter.
Other questions? Giordano.
I like your shirt. No, I just said I liked his shirt. Now you have to stand up. Be different. All right.
I would like to push you a little bit on your argument on collaborative spaces. I mean, it looks to me like outsiders, which are tourists, are saving other outsiders, which are readers. So I'm wondering, is it really possible to talk about collaborative spaces? Because doesn't seem to me from your research that that the readers, at least, neither the readers nor tourists are really making connection with the city. So I'm wondering whether the fact that tourists are basically saving the readers or allowing them by their economic activity to be there, whether they're really contributing to readers being part of the city community, or is it just temporary outsider saving other outsiders?
Okay, so let me see if I understand this. So you're saying that the tourists are there and they're getting readings, and so that's the only reason why the readers can be there and be accepted in some way. And I would argue that you're absolutely right. But what my point is that this is what we see this cooperative public that is on display. That it might not be that they're interacting in any other way, but it's what people see. And so that as thousands and millions of people go through Jackson Square and see this, it is accepted. And that matters. That matters.
All right, thank you.
So in a sense, this othering phenomenon, or racialization, as you stated, is alive and well.
Oh, it's alive and well.
Appears on the surface to be somewhat absent, as the tourists who seek out readings seek them out from the most exotic readers.
And so what we see here is a contradiction, right? It's not just that it's a cooperative, at times it's cooperative and at times it's contested. It's both of those things simultaneously. It is most certainly a space of contradictions.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how much it really is cooperative in the sense of cooperation between readers and the city.
Well, I think it's cooperative only in the sense, in an article I argue this, in terms of display, in terms of sociability of display. But that's an excellent point.
Rebecca, thank you so very
Thank
much
you.
for joining us this evening and making this wonderful presentation. We have a round of applause, please, for our guest.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please note that there are other events associated with this particular conference on race, ethnicity, and identity. Tomorrow there's a film viewing in this room, Standing in the Shadows of Motown, between 2:45 and 5. Tomorrow night, 7 to 8:30, Patriotism and Its Effects on Public Opinion on Foreign Policy, comparing the cases of the USA and Ireland. Wednesday, Confronting Mechanisms of Control, Race, Gender, and Religion in Colonial Mexico, between 10:45 and 12:15. And importantly as well, Hispanic Education in Western Michigan, a roundtable discussion on Wednesday between 2 and 4. And Thursday, Invisible Walls, Race, Ethnicity, and Social Boundaries in the City of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Very good presentation anticipated, 1 to 2:30. And the keynote, Thursday night, The Color of Christ. Thank you once again for showing up, and look forward to seeing you at other presentations. Geography lives, amen?